So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very excited to have a really great audience for this. Almost 65 people are joining us for this program today. So we're really thrilled about that. My name is Larissa Vigu-Picard. I am the Executive Director of Pejepscot History Center. And I know many of you know me and vice versa, but there are also many folks new to us today on the program, people who are not current members of Pejepscot History Center, and I do want to invite you to consider membership. I will put a link to our membership in the chat box in a little bit. We do offer great program discounts, such as on this program throughout the year. And you will, if you attend a number of programs and events throughout the year, you will basically make back your membership. Plus, there's lots of other wonderful benefits. So I do invite and encourage folks to consider becoming a member of Pejepscot History Center and support our mission, which is to preserve, interpret, and promote the rich history of Brunswick, Topsham, and Harpswell. We are very excited to have this 400 years of New Mainers presentation and conversation today with Curator Tilly Laskey, Curator at MHS, and I will formally introduce her in just a couple minutes, but there are a couple of other things I want to mention to you first. This is the kickoff program, and a great kickoff it will be, because it will provide a lot of wonderful context for the remaining year of programming about our 2022 theme of immigration. This is probably a little bit of an overdue theme, but we are excited to have it this year. And most, if not all, of our talks and presentations, which will occur monthly, our Untold Stories Elementary After School program, our walking tours this summer, the return of our half-day Hidden History Tour, which will be in June this year, and other events and activities to come will focus on this theme. So we're quite excited about that. And also our Maine Gallery exhibition, which will open Memorial Day weekend. We did have a lovely feature in the Times Record right on the front page on Tuesday about our theme, a great interview with, I had a great conversation with a reporter there, and he did a nice job with that feature. So we were really appreciative of that. I want to mention the next couple of Zoom talks, which I think will be very interesting to folks. These are going to be, our monthly programs are the second Thursday, and for February and March, we are doing Zoom still. That will be again at noon. February 10th is with Reza Jalali, who's the director of the Greater Portland Immigrant Center, and Morgan Rielli, who is a state legislator. And that together they've written a book that's just recently come out from Island Port Press called Dear Maine, The Trials and Triumphs of Maine's 21st Century Immigrants. That will be a nice, another kind of contextual presentation, bringing us up to present day in Maine and in our region. We, as I'm sure you know, have a number of new Mainers, new immigrants in our own community here, and they will be wonderful folks to speak about that. March 10th is a program with John Mann, who is the President Emeritus of the Ulster Scots Project, Maine Ulster Scots Project, and Ian Saxene, who is an associate professor at Bridgewater State University and has written a great book about early the colonists and land speculators and the Native Americans in Maine, the Wabanaki, and how the arrival of the colonists affected the Wabanaki and how negotiations went on over land. And the two of them will be talking about the arrival specifically of the Ulster Scots and the impact on the Wabanaki population that was here at the time, and how, of course, that still resonates today. In April, we'll have a wonderful program about an Italian immigrant family that came into the area, and that's going to be by Tom Santaguida, who is a present-day fisherman in the Brunswick and Harpswell areas. He will be, that's a program in collaboration with the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And then in May, we'll be doing a Franco-American program in collaboration with Anna Faraday, who's the archivist from the Franco-American collection at USM. So we've got lots more than that will be coming up throughout the year, but I just wanted to highlight those programs, which should be pretty exciting. So without further ado, I'm going to get us right into today's program, which will be about a 25 to 30-minute presentation by Tilly, and perhaps a brief follow-up conversation between myself and Tilly, but then we will be sure to get to any questions that appear in the chat box, and that is the preferred way to ask a question today. We, with 65 or so people in this or registered for this program today, there's just no way to see all of your hands and so forth. So if you can put any comments or questions in the chat box, that would be really helpful. And our goal will be to wrap up right around 1 o'clock today. So before I officially turn it over to Tilly, I would like to tell you a little bit about her. Tilly Laskey is a museum curator, and as I mentioned, she is curator at Maine Historical. And she specializes in Indigenous art and culture. She was born and raised in Brunswick, and she will talk a little bit about that. But she has also worked at nationally recognized museums in addition to Maine in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and South Dakota. She joined MHS in 2014, and she currently works both as the curator, works as the curator, and she creates both on-site exhibits and exhibits on Maine Memory Network, which is MHS's statewide digital museum, which is quite fabulous if you're not familiar with it. She has curated and co-curated a number of significant exhibitions there, which she will talk some about today. She has also published a number of articles and book chapters, and she is the co-author of a recently published book, Precious and Adored, The Love Letters of Rose Cleveland and Evangeline Mars Whipple, 1890 to 1918. That was published in 2019, but the University of Pisa, yes, in Italy, published an Italian translation of the book in 2021, which is pretty nifty. So with that said, I will ask Tilly to take over, and she is going to share her screen, I know.
Let's see. Hi, everybody. I am in the process of trying to get this shared. Okay.
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
All right, great. Okay, so thanks very much for having me, Larissa. It's a real honor to be here with all of you today. And I just really want to commend Larissa for all of the work that she's doing at the Pejepscot Historical History Center. And I think that the last few years have been a great leap of stability for the organization. So thanks for all of your work. And so as Larissa said today, I'm going to be discussing the exhibitions that I've worked on at Maine Historical Society in the past few years, and specifically looking at certain immigration stories within them. And most of the images that you'll see are from installation photos from those exhibits or items that are on Maine Memory Network. And each of these exhibits has a Maine Memory Network exhibit. So if you're interested in learning more, you can always go on mainmemory.net and read more about those. So these are the 4 exhibits I'm looking at today. I will not go in chronological order, but they occurred in, first was 400 Years of New Mainers, and then Holding Up the Sky, State of Mind, and Begin Again. So some of you probably recognize this as Wharton's Point here in Brunswick on Maquoit Bay. I want you to remember that Wharton name for later, but this is near the place that I'm joining you from today in what is currently called West Brunswick, the past, present, and future homelands of the Wabanaki Nations. The land and water here has supported me and my family, much in the same way other white people have benefited from land taken from Wabanaki peoples in Maine. And as settlers, we've accepted ownership of these Wabanaki spaces with very few questions over many generations. And I invite you to think about this as we have our conversation today. I also want to acknowledge my personal roots and the people that I descend from here in Brunswick, Bath, and Georgetown. They were laborers, educators, fishermen, farmers, and ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives, who were not normally represented in institutions like Maine Historical Society or a lot of other institutions. And this is something that I'm really working to change, not just for the people I come from, but for all of the people who haven't been properly represented. So diving into Holding Up the Sky, what is currently known as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, as I stated earlier. Wabanaki is the overarching word that encompasses the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations. And Maine Historical Society mounted Holding Up the Sky in 2019 as our first Maine bicentennial exhibition. Maine turned 200 in 2020. But we felt that we couldn't possibly explore Maine's first 200 years as a state without first looking at the 13,000 years of Indigenous habitation. Sharing authority is an important part of my work. And for Holding Up the Sky, I co-curated with these 7 Wabanaki people. Their knowledge and generosity created an incredible and forward-looking exhibition and an online resource. And like I said, you can get to that exhibit on mainmemory.net. So when we talk about immigration, I think, and we talk about Wabanaki habitation here in Maine, it's important first to look at oral histories. And especially for the Penobscot, their creation history says that Gluskabe, who was the first man, created the Wabanaki by shooting an arrow into an ash tree. And when the ash tree split open, out came the Wabanaki people singing and dancing along with all of the other animals. And so these 2 contemporary artworks by Penobscot people show that moment that Gluskabe's arrow hit the tree. And so their thoughts are they say they've always been here. And then we go to what science says. And so science tells us that the glaciers covered Maine up until about 15,000 years ago. And as the climate warmed, the tundra landscape and the large game evolved, including things like woolly mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats. And then between 9,000 and 13,000 years ago, the Paleo Indians, who are the ancestors of the Wabanaki, followed that big game and hunting and living in what is now called Maine. So about 500 years ago, Wabanaki people first started receiving European visitors. And again, that's our documented 500 years ago. So this included Basque fishermen, Italian explorers, French fur traders, and later the English settler colonialists who came to live here in Wabanaki homelands. And the Wabanaki prophecies actually predicted this movement of people into their home. And Joseph Nicolar, who's Pejepscot, recorded this in the 1800s, late 1800s, and he recorded this prophecy saying that when the strangers came, that we should try to make friends with them, and if possible, make brothers of them. Lisa Brooks wrote a great book called Our Beloved Kin, based on that idea that Indigenous people were trying to make kin of the people coming into their homelands. So as English-speaking people began to settle along the coast of Maine in the early 1600s, Wabanaki people worked at diplomacy and creating these renewable family connections with the newcomers, such as asking for yearly annuities in order to create that connection every year between the two communities. And the written language of the English, as compared to these ideas of verbal agreements and using wampum as a way to make those verbal agreements, led to a lot of confusion between the Wabanaki and the English people, which ended up with deliberate dispossession of land by the English of Wabanaki land. So even as the Wabanaki people were striving to incorporate settlers into their Indigenous cultural and economic systems, the settlers were just trying to get their signatures on documents like deeds for land ownership and other political documents. The wampum protocols are still used today in Wabanaki communities. At Sipayak and Indian Township, the Passamaquoddy communities, they use the belt that Donald Soktoma is wearing on his shoulder in this image, and they renew their ties every year with one another through the use of that belt. And his great-grandmother, Mary Mitchell Selmore, is pictured in that 1901 image wearing a wampum belt around her collar that's actually displayed in the case behind Donald. So in 1711, the Aroostook Treaty was signed. So that's down in Georgetown. And during the treaties, there are these long negotiations that happen, and they're actually documented in these treaties that are held at Maine Historical Society. So it's actually 1717, not 1711, sorry. So the Wabanaki leaders were trying to get the English to understand that the land didn't have the ecological capacity to carry all of the people who were moving into the area. And Wiruna, one of the leaders, met with the Massachusetts Governor Schutte, and they told him and confronted him about the encroaching settlements and trading posts that were violating the treaties and the previous agreements. Wiruna said that the territory didn't have the resources to host this many settlers and who were increasingly impacting their homeland. And what I find really interesting in this treaty is looking at the responses of the English to this, constant pushing back of the Wabanaki people saying, we can't support you. So they're trying to make kin of these English, right? We can't support you, we can't take care of you because there are too many of you coming. And Governor Schutte says, they must not call it their land, for the English have bought it from them and their ancestors. And when Wiruna says, well, you didn't buy it, we're allowing you to use it. And Schutte says, we desire only what is our own, and that we will have. So the other thing to note here is that 1717 is right around the same time that the Ulster Scots were coming into the area, into the Brunswick area. So there really was, this influx of people moving in. So with the settler colonialists thinking that they owned the land and the Wabanaki people thinking of the spaces as shared, there was inevitable conflict that was going to happen. The English settlers in Brunswick noted the Androscoggin River's abundant fish runs, and in 1673, a commercial fishing operation at the Pejepscot Falls took 40 barrels of salmon and more than 90 kegs of sturgeon in a 3 weeks' time. So they were just like netting everything. For the Wabanaki, the fishery was hoarding and caused an imbalance with the fish population. So they were confronting the settlers about this. And so at the same time, King Philip's War is starting to happen down in Massachusetts, and Maine was really on the northern border of King Philip's War. And in September of 1676, Thomas Purchase's trading house in Portland was raided by Native people. And then by 1696, the English settlers had basically abandoned the entire coast of Maine, like 60 miles up from Casco Bay. And they became refugees in Massachusetts. So some of them started returning in the early 1700s, but they lived a quasi-military life. So they were living in garrison houses, they had stockades, and they felt they needed protection. And in 1737, the residents of Brunswick petitioned Massachusetts to maintain Fort George because Massachusetts was going to just stop funding the fort. But it's interesting to say, the reasoning was that the Wabanaki, quote, look upon us as unjust usurpers and intruders upon their rights and privileges. Again, there's just this inability to understand why the conflicts are happening. By 1755, settler populations in Maine had skyrocketed, increasing pressures between white and Wabanaki communities. New England states issued at least 72 proclamations from 1675 to 1760, paying settlers for the scalps of Indigenous people. These so-called scalp bounties included the Phipps Proclamation of 1755 that targeted Penobscot people. In 2020, MHS commissioned Penobscot artist and historian James Eric Francis Sr. to create a work about the Maine bicentennial. And there were no conditions on it. He could paint whatever he wanted. So what he ended up creating was an exact replica of the Phipps Proclamation at 4 by 5 feet tall, with the Penobscot word for "we walk on eternally" painted across the proclamation. Francis said that the painting, quote, urges the citizens of Maine to join hands with the Indigenous population and walk eternally into the future and move beyond the deadly acts of the past. So it's with this framework that I ask you to consider what's known locally as the Thomas Means Massacre. These attacks were on Ulster Scott's family on the Flying Point Road in Freeport and occurred in 1756 at a time when Native people, and we're talking men, women, and children, were being hunted in their homelands for their scalps. And the scalp bounties were paying up to $60,000 for one scalp at one point in today's money. So it was lucrative for people to kill Native people. So this letter from about those attacks from Maine Historical Society's collections details these 2 strikes that happened in Brunswick. One on the Means family, where Thomas Means and his 16-month-old son were murdered by Native people, as well as an attack on Abijah Young, where he was taken prisoner and taken to Canada, where he eventually died of smallpox. So despite 500 years of contact and conflict with settlers and being hunted in their homeland, Wabanaki people continue to survive and thrive and create today. Okay, so after holding up the sky and establishing Maine as Wabanaki homelands, Maine Historical Society mounted a commemoration of the state bicentennial in 2020. And we opened up on March 13th and closed 2 days later on the actual date of the bicentennial, March 15th, because of the pandemic. And luckily we were able to open up later on in the summer, but we were really affected by the pandemic. I had curated the exhibition with 8 advisors from 4 different communities, including the Wabanaki, French Acadian, Black and English-speaking peoples. And we chose these communities because they were the first to settle in Maine and continue living here today. As with most of the exhibits that I curate, there is no real timeline, and the past and the present commingle. Similarly, the experiences of the 4 communities were woven together throughout the exhibit. So a lot of people are really surprised to learn that French men, including Samuel de Champlain, established the first permanent European settlement in Maine in 1604 on St. Croix Island. The French Acadians' experiences living on a moving border between the French, British, and American control, and eventually leading to their forced and violent removal between 1755 and 1763, is immortalized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Evangeline. The gross tet or giant head puppet seen in the photo here is called Evangeline and recalls that story. For a state known as one of the whitest in the nation, Maine has had a remarkably long and strong Black presence. Black people have been in Maine since the first settler colonialists arrived, and slavery was present here since the 1600s. Other Black people arrived as free, and many were crew on sailing vessels. State of Mind established this important history and the prejudice that some Black people have encountered, including the forced removal of the mixed race community on Malaga Island off the coast of Phippsburg in 1912. Portland-based artist Daniel Minter eloquently honors and recalls the story of Malaga residents in much of his artwork, including this multimedia piece seen on the left. One of the most intriguing aspects for me of Maine statehood is that the northern border of the state wasn't settled until 1842. We became a state in 1820. This imaginary line randomly split communities, including the Maliseet, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy people, and also the Acadian villages. And for years, people didn't know whether they were American or Canadian. In 2016, I co-curated 400 Years of New Mainers with Reza Jalali, who will be speaking to you next month. And as Larissa said, he's the director of the Immigrant Welcome Center in Portland. The 400 Years established Maine as Wabanaki homelands and then looked at the diversity of the subsequent settlers and people who came here to live. From English-speaking people who came in the 1600s to these so-called New Mainers or recent immigrants to the state. Goals were to show that if you aren't of Wabanaki descent, you and your ancestors were at one time a New Mainer, even if they came 400 years ago. "400 Years was an opportunity to review many of the diverse populations in Maine, including Chinese people. Toi Langun skirted the Chinese Exclusion Act with her husband Dogon, who was a US citizen. So he married her and brought her over from China. The family opened a laundry business in Portland in the 1920s. Toi Len successfully raised her 8 children after her husband died, which contributed to her winning the US Mother of the Year award in 1952, something that Toyland's granddaughter, Andrea Louis, who's writing a book about her, called a political move, saying, quote, "They deployed her image as part of a cultural Cold War as the United States tried to extend its influence in Asia." The other goal was to demonstrate that different waves of immigration tell similar stories, but are sometimes handled really differently by the state when people come in. In 1870, William Widgery Thomas, he was Maine's first and only commissioner of immigration, brought 51 Swedes to Maine. Each of them received 100 acres of land, a log home, provisions, seed stock, and cash support from the state of Maine. Then Governor Joshua Chamberlain called New Sweden, quote, "one of the most important achievements of the history of Maine," and commended the legislature for, quote, "the most liberal policy on the part of the state to support and foster New Sweden and the speedy settlement of our great wilderness domain," end quote. After 3 years, the colony was self-sustaining and they no longer needed state aid. "400 Years" had a number of different interactives to help people visualize immigration to Maine. And originally, I had planned to remove the strings from this map. So we asked people to put a pin where they came from or their ancestors came from, and then where they live in Maine. And so I originally was going to clear it off every week, but it just grew into this amazing mass of showing where these people came from. And so we decided to leave it up, and I'm glad we did. So that's what the picture on the right is. Another interactive asked visitors what they would bring with them if they had to leave their homes forever with just one suitcase. People answered with Post-it notes. Some of them were pragmatic and others were existential. For me, seeing this young Muslim woman on the left, reading the Post-it notes and looking at an image of a woman that looked like her was a really powerful reminder about representation. And I think this was probably the first time that particular scenario ever happened at Maine Historical Society. Another way we engaged the community included working with graffiti artist Pigeon. We installed Pigeon's drawings on the exterior of the MHS building, and they asked probing questions about who can call themselves a Mainer and what does the word Mainer mean. So in 2021, MHS had planned on opening an exhibit about fashion. But when a Minneapolis policeman murdered George Floyd in May of 2020, we pivoted and began planning for an exhibit that we eventually called Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine. We wanted to contribute to the conversation by examining Maine's past, to scrutinize the systems that perpetuate inequities, and to look for paths to create a new society where we might, as author James Baldwin noted, begin again. My co-curators included Ann Gass, Darren Ranko, and Crystal Williams, who are all very smart and very well-versed people who signed on to create this exhibit in about 7 months. And for reference, most exhibits take about 2 to 5 years to install. And it was just a tremendous commitment on their part. And I'm forever grateful for their work. So to understand systemic racism in the New World, we went back 528 years to the original documents of governance and settlement from Europe. A year after Christopher Columbus's 1492 journey, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull that legalized stealing of indigenous land in what is now known as the Americas, justifying the genocide of non-Christians. A previous proclamation in 1452 approved the murder and enslavement of African people. These doctrines of Christian discovery and domination are the foundation of settler colonialist supremacy, woven into all aspects of American life, and are the basis of the legal, economic, and social systems today. The doctrines shaped the ideologies of the framers of the US Constitution who, while writing "all men are created equal," suppressed women's rights, lived on stolen land, and profited from slavery. These ideologies remain present and were cited as recently as 2005 in the US Supreme Court. We created two paths of experience, that of the privileged and that of the non-privileged, separated by a red curtain that symbolizes the red blood that we all share and the blood that has been shed in violence in Maine. Because many people were not able to visit in person because of the pandemic, and because technology allowed it, MHS created a 3D experience for Begin Again, and that's what those little red tags are in that picture. So you can go online and have a 3D experience with Begin Again, because we did take it down just the end of last year. Topics we examined included Maine's connection to slavery through merchant shipping, fishing, and sugar processing, and how stereotypes and dehumanization lead to violence and nativist ideologies like Americanization and the Ku Klux Klan. In 1923, Maine had one of the largest KKK memberships outside of the American South, estimated at 23% of the population. They targeted Black people, but also Catholics, Jews, recent immigrants, and Wabanaki people. The Ulster Scott story in Brunswick was featured in Begin Again, told through documents housed in the MHS archives called the Pejepscot Proprietor Papers. As mentioned earlier, the conflicts between the Wabanakis and settlers during King Philip's War in 1675 rendered the District of Maine unsafe. When the settlers began returning to Maine, they demanded oaths of loyalty from the Wabanaki leaders. The Wabanakis allowed use of land around the Kennebec, Androscoggin, and Casco Bay regions through deeds issued to Richard Wharton, so Wharton Point here in Brunswick. Wharton was a Boston merchant, land proprietor, attorney, and slave trader. The oath reads like a treaty and traces diplomatic agreements Native people made by the, quote, ancient Indian grants dating back to Ferdinando Gorges in the early 1600s. This deed ensures Wabanaki rights to planting, hunting, fishing, and fowling. However, it doesn't usurp any of their rights. Despite these oaths of loyalty, settlers were not eager to return to the Maine frontier. Richard Wharton eventually sold his parcels, including the towns now known as Brunswick, Topsham, Harpswell, and Lewiston, to a group of businessmen from Boston who formed the Pejepscot Proprietors in 1713. People from the Scottish lowlands attempted to colonize Northern Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries, supported by the English. In the early 1700s, these people, who we now call the Ulster Scots, faced religious discrimination and violence in Ireland. They negotiated with Massachusetts Governor Shute, the same governor who was less than civil with the Wabanakis in Georgetown, to settle in Maine and hold back the Wabanakis so that more settlers could move to Maine. In return, they were granted land. In England, landholders held on to their property and they rented out lots to tenants, but never lost their land base if they could help it. This new mode of operating, of allowing individuals to own plots of land in the New World, was life-changing for the Ulster Scots. Presbyterian Reverend James Woodside brought one of the first boats from Ireland with 40 families to settle in Brunswick in 1718. Woodside was the second pastor hired by the Pejepscot proprietors, but the town quickly determined Woodside wasn't puritanical enough to continue preaching there. James Woodside returned to England in 1720, but his son William kept the land allotment on Bungannock Road and stayed in Brunswick, running a trading post and working at Fort George. The Ulster Scott families who came to Maine with James Woodside planned on staying together as a community. In Brunswick, the descendants of the first Ulster Scots, including the Woodsides, Dunnings, Dunlaps, Givens, Simpsons, Wilsons, and McFaddens, continue to live in the area. Census data confirms that per capita, Maine has the highest percentage of self-identified Scots descendants in the entire United States and ranks third in the country for Ulster Scott descendants. With National Endowment for the Humanities funding, MHS is digitizing the proprietor papers, along with the Pejepscot proprietor papers, along with the Kennebec proprietor and Northeast Boundary collections. This will be an incredible resource for anyone interested in the settlement of Maine and Brunswick in particular. You can participate yourself if you want to by helping to transcribe over 20,000 pages from these collections on a platform called Zooniverse, and I'll be glad to give you more of those, more information about that. The finished product will eventually be on Maine Memory Network, and so it'll be accessible to anyone around the world. So the families who have lived in Maine for many generations often refer to people from out of state or newcomers as from away. And even though it's often said tongue in cheek, this ideology creates a sense of otherness and promotes division. People who live in Maine, in my opinion, are from here. And I invite you to use this methodology to reconsider your personal history with immigration and how people coming to Maine and how we treat people coming to Maine. So this was a collage that we actually had in Begin Again. All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening and your patience as I whizzed through 528 years.
That was fantastic, Tilly. Thank you so much. I think we're especially lucky to have you in our own community and as a resource, so locally and statewide, and have you at the State Historical Society. It's just great. You have some amazing background and skills and expertise. And one thing we have about 15 minutes, so I do want to, turn it over to some questions in the chat. And I do see that we have one in there right now. But first, I just wanted to ask you about your experiences outside of the state. Before you returned home and took a position at MHS, how those positions might have informed what you have been doing at MHS and the way you think about both Indigenous populations and the populations that have come into the state. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most transformative experiences I ever had was my first museum job was at the Hudson Museum at the University of Maine up in Orono. And I should also explain that my background is I'm an anthropologist and an art historian. And so I don't have a degree in history, but I think that helps to inform the way I look at history and bring stories together. So working directly with communities sometimes means, like, a lot of people have asked me, well, where is that published? Where can I read that? And it's like, well, it's an oral history that isn't published, and it's been shared by a community. And so I think that being able to reform the way we think about academia and about how museums participate in that is really important, and that the stories that people carry themselves are just as valid as these peer-reviewed articles that are published in books. So and yeah, I mean, working with Native communities has changed my life, and definitely changed the way I like to work collaboratively. I don't think we should, it's if you're representing a community, they should be involved with whatever you're doing. So those are the lessons I've learned over 30 years of making a lot of mistakes.
That's a great point to bring folks in. Do you have recommendations for how to best do that? To not make people feel like they're sort of the token representative, so to speak, but to really invite them into the conversation from the beginning.
I think bringing people in from the very beginning and asking them what they want to see, rather than saying, we're doing this exhibit on X, Y, and Z, and can you write a label about this or give me a picture, So rather than being extractive, being collaborative,
Mhm.
and really bringing folks in at the very beginning so that they feel like they're a part of it, which, is what we want. We want them to feel invested, and not to feel like we just like checked a box and then moved on. And it takes years to build trust, and it takes a really long time to create those collaborations. So don't expect it to happen overnight, and I mean, the pandemic has complicated things, but go to events, talk to people, pick up the phone. It's easy to email people and forget that you can just pick up the phone and call them. So
Absolutely. Sometimes the human voice itself is, just that friendly outreach, rather than yet another email in our inbox. I'm going to just pivot to a couple things in the chat box here to make sure we address some things people have asked. There is somebody who would like to know more about Zooniverse, and I do want to say that Tilly a while back invited us to get in on that, and I am still still working on that. We would love to have some of our own volunteers participate in this, because we do have relevant documents in our collection. But go ahead, talk a little bit more about that project and how people can get involved.
yeah, so Zooniverse is a platform that was actually created for the scientific community to have crowdsourcing, to crowdsource and have people do things like count penguins in photographs, like in drone photographs. And we were able to get them to kind of allow historical documents to be added so that we could crowdsource and get people to transcribe these thousands and thousands of pages that we have from the proprietors. And basically, you create an account, and then you choose what pages you want to transcribe. And those pages need to be transcribed the same way by 5 people, like confirmed by 5 people. And then once that's done, it gets sent to Maine Historical Society to reconcile it. So eventually what will happen is there will be a digitized page of that original manuscript, and then the transcription right beside it. And you'll be able to flip through it like a book online, sort of like Hathi Trust, but with a transcription and an original. it's also really similar to the way we've done things on Maine Memory Network for years. So Maine Memory is a collaborative of about 300 organizations that add items, historical items to the network. And if you put up a document, like something handwritten, even something typewritten, we need a transcription to go along with it for ADA compliance. And plus, reading 19th century script is really hard sometimes. So yeah, so it kind of matches the Maine Memory Network ethos of having a transcription with everything. But it's, I think it's zooniverse.com. Like I said, I can send the exact information to Larissa and, oh, yep, you've got it, zooniverse.org. Okay.
Yep, I put it in there. I also, if people scroll up in the chat box, I did put a link to mainmemory.net, and I put a link to past exhibits at MHS. There was a question directly to me regarding how to access some of the exhibits that Tilly referenced, and you can find information on them in one or both of those places at the Maine Historical website. Let's see, I see a question here, wondering if the mention of the Scottish indentured servants from the Battle of Dunbar, indentures at the Great Works Sawmill and what is now called Berwick, will be included in the work. I think perhaps meaning, I don't know, our exhibit or perhaps our programs this year. I'm not sure that's a direct question for Tilly or not. I'm going to say that we won't be directly referencing Berwick. We're going to focus on Brunswick, Topsham, Harpswell region. And I don't know a whole lot about that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important topic, and the Berwick Historical Society has done really good work on that. And yeah, so the prisoners, we have a couple of things on Maine Memory, like a drawing of the prison from one of the prisoners. But these Scottish prisoners were sent to the Americas. They were given the option of staying in prison or being indentured and going and working in the frontier in the New World. And many of them chose that, but they were able to work off their indenture, right? And then become free people. And many of them settled up here in Maine. And I know that there are quite a few people who descend from them in this region.
We also have a question regarding the word Androscoggin, which of course is our river. But also Andros was an English governor. And this person says, I've sometimes seen the word Amerascoggin, wondering what your thoughts are about this. I confess I don't have a good response to that myself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a linguist, but I think that the word Androscoggin is probably an English pronunciation of a Wabanaki word. I'm
a great person who's done a lot of work on Wabanaki place names in Maine is Joe Hall at Bates College. He and his students, he's a history professor there, he and his students have done a lot of work on that. And if you, I'm not remembering exactly now what to Google, but you could Google Joe Hall, Bates, Wabanaki, and you would eventually come up with his students' work on mapping and place names.
Yeah, it's the Western place name, Wabanaki Western place names, Western Maine place names. And
excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great resource, and that will give you the published where they found the information about where that name derives from. So that's a great idea, Larissa.
Yeah. we also have a comment by one of our longtime members. Many of the early European settlers are buried in the First Parish, McCoy and Growstown cemeteries. Many of the stones are in desperate need of restoration. So that's a call out for volunteers for that great cause. And if you're interested, I can put you in touch with the person who posted that. That's Kathy Leonard. And we also have a comment that somebody mentioned they're surprised to hear their great grandfather's name mentioned, and that's again indicative of how we have descendants in our area from these early families. David Gavine, he mentions arriving in about 1740. So that's, one big reason why we're doing this theme this year is because we certainly do have a lot of families and family names that we're familiar with in the area that relate to some of these early arrivals, but we also want to focus on some of the lesser known stories that we don't hear as much about this year that are really hard to find in the collections, either because nothing was collected on those families, because they weren't deemed important at one time or another, or because of the way things are cataloged, and those stories just were not sort of mined in the collections, if you will. So we are going to be asking the community to really share their stories of ancestors and other immigrant populations and families that you know of throughout the year to help us kind of round out the stories that we do have. I see that it's just about 1 o'clock here, and Tilly has posted the link to Joe Hall's Wabanaki Place Names map, and somebody did put Joe Hall's EJ Hall at Bates email in there if you're interested in that. Tilly, as we kind of wrap up here, I just want to thank you again for what is a really great sort of presentation, providing a lot of great context for us as we go throughout the year. I had a lot of questions I could have asked you. You certainly covered a lot of great territory. But how do you think, I guess, we hear the word immigration today, and there's a lot of stuff loaded in that word nationally and certainly within our state as well. How do you feel like your own thinking has changed as you've done the work over the last few years at MHS about immigration into this state, about the population of our state? And again, you referenced the point about Maine being the whitest state, and that's both a true fact and also a stereotype we get hit with all the time that sort of misses the point that there have been people of color here since the beginning, obviously. So I guess just some final thoughts from you, I guess, before we close.
Right. Well, I think that what's really important is to recognize Wabanaki's sovereignty in this place, first and foremost, and then to also recognize that there have been people of color who have always been here as well, who came in at the same time the settler colonialists came. So there's that very long and deep history. But as far as the white population goes, and those numbers, it's like what 96% of Maine is quote unquote white. But there's such diversity in that idea of what is white, right? So you've got like Franco communities, you've got the Scots Irish, you've got Italian, you've got Irish, you've got all of these people who have very distinct cultures that they brought with them. And and hopefully we'll be able to continue. That's the issue between settler colonialism, which expects people to just conform to the, like, we're going to take over the government and then you have to be like us, and allowing people to maintain their, the beauty of their culture and their languages rather than squelching it like, the Americanization programs did in the 1920s. So yeah, I guess I just really love people finding more about their families, like go do some genealogical research and talk to your elders and learn more about your family, and tell your kids about it, tell your grandkids about it, like spread the word and be proud of who you are. Like, as I said, my family's tenure here in this place came at the expense and a lot of harm to Wabanaki people. That doesn't mean, there's no binary that says, like, even though that happened, it doesn't mean I can't be proud of them, and it doesn't mean that I don't respect my family for their tenacity and living in a really hard scrabble way for many years. So they were tough, and I really respect that.
I think that's a great way to wrap up. I look forward to kind of staying in conversation with you throughout the year, and I look forward to seeing many of the faces that have been on the program today and names that have been on today at our future programs. You can find all the program information at pejepscothistorical.org/events. If you aren't on our e-list, please let us know that. Go to our website, and there's a way to sign up there, or send one of us, go to our About Us page and contact page and send one of us an email, and we'll be glad to put you on that list. Thank you so much for your time today, and we hope you all have a great weekend ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Waliwan.
Thank you so much, Tilly. That was excellent.